Art? Okay. Any, yes.
Hi, Andy Carter, you have a family camp on Newbury Neck Road. As far as the state is concerned and all the other organizations that are involved with permitting, what level of shoreline stabilization is allowed versus restoration? So as we talked about, we've lost 4 to 8 feet along a lot of these shorelines. Is it allowable to restore that amount of lost land, or do you just have to stabilize what's currently there now?
I'll take the first stab at that. So generally, the way it's treated is the way it is now. Where the hat is now is where the hat is, and that's what you're sort of permitting against, I guess, not necessarily. But it doesn't mean that you can't go, so if here's your line, that's where it is now. It doesn't mean you couldn't propose, if you needed to go out to make your extension. It's just minimization is the big permit piece. And getting past that minimization threshold that you're not contributing or filling more than is necessary for that activity is probably the hard part of rebuilding any bank to where it was. So
No, you're correct. One of the questions or one of the submittals in the application is how are we avoiding and minimizing the impacts? And that goes back to avoiding or minimizing the amount of soil disturbance. So if we're bringing in more soil, odds are we're creating more alteration. And again, we're against that hat line where it is today. And so typically it is more of a protection versus a restoration.
I can also just speak to a process standpoint. Often once it's been taken, putting fresh material down has not had the time to compact, to consolidate. We see with beach nourishment, it can erode 30% faster than what it was intended to replace as well. So it's sort of the idea of going back 3 or 4 feet to what was there often sets itself up to be removed even quicker.
that's another, just because we were nerding about this earlier, is that anytime, one of the things with minimization is minimizing damage to the soil structure too. Even if you come in and you think, oh, it's hard to vegetate this, I'll just till it and I'll seed it. But like you've made it more erodible now by mixing that soil up. And one interesting thing that I don't know that we really knew so much about it 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but the bacteria and fungus in the soil that is residing in there is super important to the structure. They actually secrete a glue that helps hold the soil particles together. So that natural biology in the soil is also kind of important to keep. But so anytime you bring new soil in, I guess getting back to that is, it is going to be tougher to get it to that stable state that the rest of the soil, even if it's the same texture and everything else.
Yeah, question for John. What can homeowners do in the spring and the fall that's just a good practice for vegetation on their slopes that doesn't require a permit?
Yeah, it's a very leading question you had there. So one thing that's really is seasonal. So it takes a little bit of explanation. DEP regulates removal of vegetation structures and soil disturbance within 75 feet of the hat for the coastal folks. And one of the techniques, a couple techniques, so seeding, if you're using native seed, there's a piece about using native vegetation. Seeding doesn't require a permit because it's not soil disturbance, vegetation removal, or structure. Similarly with live staking, and those techniques that I showed you a couple slides ago, you can actually do that without a permit because it's not considered soil disturbance. So if you're not digging it in, you're just pushing it into the ground, or using a piece of rebar and you tap it in to make a pilot hole and stick it in. Willows, elderberry, meadowsweet, there's a whole, so there's like 30 really easily rooted, they're mostly hardwood shrubs that you're going to find in wet areas. We'll do that as long as you harvest it while it's dormant and get it installed while it's dormant. The willows will do it during the growing season, because they're special. But most of them do require it to be dormant. And they just basically are adapted to, if they got sheared off by ice or something on the shoreline, they'd float somewhere else, land, and root back in and create another plant. That's sort of their adaptation. So they tend to be shoreline plants as well. Yes?
Can that work on saltwater shores?
Yeah, there's limitations, just like with any plants, with being able to handle the salinity. But there are a number of shrubs, any shrub that's a hardwood that you might be seeing on your shoreline probably has the ability to do it, even with a little bit of rooting hormone assistance. They can work well too. But yeah, there are not as many species that work in really salty environments, but there are quite a few.
Let me just jump in to make you aware. If you go to the Deer Isle, Town of Deer Isle website, they have a good guide to different kinds of vegetation to use in shoreline stabilization.
Yes, and specifically, then there are also grasses and other things in some of these guides that are also specifically suited for the saltwater environment. So it is important to look at the guides and are they salt tolerant? Are they highly salt tolerant?
There's a really great guide that the Cumberland County Soil and Water District was that with, it was with a couple of others. You guys contributed to that, I
We
think.
contributed to that Greater Portland Council, but Cumberland Water.
Yeah, so there's a planting
Fantastic
guide,
planting guide.
coastal planting guide that they put out, and it's got really great tables in it for vegetation types, and it basically says whether it works at the top of the bank, middle of the bank, bottom of the bank, whether they're salt tolerant, extremely salt tolerant, or not at all. So you can, and things like moisture and light and soil types, it kind of gets into all those different things. Because with vegetation, that is a really tricky thing, because plants like a very specific place to be. And so sometimes convincing them that they want to be in a place is the hardest part.
Thank you for mentioning that. One thing I regret not showing the photo, but one of the most resilient shorelines we had in the January storms were actually the rose bushes. And there are invasive and there are natives. But that mesh, that Velcro and basket weave of root structures really can take a beating. It's very high surface area. It just kind of rolled over on itself and stayed put. And even if it tears, roses love a pruning, and so it starts to grow back very early on as well and help stabilize some of those genes and systems. Those shrubs are very effective.
Also good for keeping people out of places you don't want them.
George?
Thank you for the presentations. My observation during the storm was that a lot of the damage was not just done by water wave action, but by water wave driving battering rams of debris that was already in the water, and then lots that was contributed by the storm from my neighbors. Do the models and the solutions you've proposed deal with the damage that's done by water-driven debris, and is that add another consideration for how we could armor and protect the shoreline?
It's certainly a consideration. I'm not sure of any model that will look at it that finely to put a staircase or a dock in the model and impact the damage, but we can understand that moving objects or trees that wash down the river can do quite a bit when they're carried by the water and the hydraulic forces. This is, again, some of the incentive of trying to stabilize and anchor with any materials and not have things that are easily ripped up or removed. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I don't think the modeling looks that closely at battering rams, but it is something to consider. One thing that Andrew rose as a good point, though, is the debris lines match the flood maps very well. And it's something we're looking at even with the different directions of storms. And so it's something that we look to update and validate, but it's good planning to know that our debris lines are ending up where the floods say they will. Yeah, the other trouble is going to get your neighbor to go get their staircase back.
Well, and there's another piece, so there's the direct, like, it's tearing up the bank by throwing stuff at it, you know? But it's also, sometimes it rafts up onto the shore, and then that can pull back down or roll around and disturb soil, or it can just sit there and kill vegetation, and then the next storm pulls it away, and there's a big bare spot. You know, I've seen that before too, and, you know, it is more limited than, you know, you're not losing the whole bank, but there is now a disturbed piece that may be more easily eroded, and if you have good vegetation around it, it'll be recolonized. But that is a concern too, that we have to think about what could end up there.
Rob?
As far as most of the people that here live on the bay, Union River Bay, Morgan Bay, some bay or other, most of the storms that come in are coming in running down the bay as opposed to straight across. There's areas like the carrying place that get hit directly with those three storms. Most people are getting hit from an angle, and I hadn't heard you mention anything about small versions of jetties, so that, because the storm's coming down, it's gonna break it before it gets to the shore, and if it goes over the jetty, it's just gonna deliver stuff on the other side of it. But a lot of this stuff is designed for the storm hitting directly at it, but it seemed like a preemptive way to stop a lot of push would be the small type of jetties sticking out from that.
So I don't have a slide on it, but that is one of the things that's, so there's pluses and minuses to jetties. You know, just ask anyone in Camp Ellis down in southern Maine. You know, it stops the movement of, the natural movement of sediment along the shore, so it usually catches one area and another area erodes way more. So we don't necessarily recommend jetties per se. And anything like that would be considered a fill within the resource, so that would have to be adequately minimized, and you have to look at alternatives to that first. But that said, I have seen jetties go in and structures like that, not necessarily on the coast, more in rivers once again, because they use them as a deflection, but they don't go super far out. So it is meant to actually slow the water down and push a channel out further into the resource. There are structures that people are proposed, and I don't know that any, Nick, you guys might know, WADs, the wave attenuation structures, or manufactured reefs, which are like an offshore kind of barrier. And some of them are concrete with like a hollow structure, and the waves kind of get lost in them and they lose their energy before it smacks the shoreline. That's probably the most similar, more, I don't know, greenish. It's not really, but it's a way to not have to directly damage the shoreline. You're kind of dealing with some of that energy out in the resource, but it's tricky and not, the permitting is very difficult because it's a direct impact, and you have to show that you've looked at everything else, and oftentimes they're going to look at something on the land as less damaging than in the resource, even though that habitat shoreline area is really important for the resource's health.
Couldn't some of those barriers actually be improving habitat though? You're
Yeah.
creating an area with seaweed and mussels and
And that-
they're not gonna be there, but snails and fish can hide in all those areas if you put something like that.
There's similar projects too, like the oyster sills, oyster bag sills.
Yes, so there are a number of projects attempting this and experimenting with this, and natural examples of oyster reefs, and even effects that aquaculture projects have had to reduce wave energy right around them, something to attenuate. It's considered a tranquility measure is the new term.
Oh.
And we've seen, but it's often not really done on an individual level, again, because the permitting out in the water is very difficult. And it can be very expensive. There are towns that have considered, especially for harbor protection, something like a floating structure, again, to do wave attenuation, but there are a lot of concerns with how it gets installed, funded, and even anchored. We've just talked about objects being moved in storms. But there is some merit to trying to get out ahead of your shoreline and taking a wave out at its ankles. And there are some projects that have been put forward where even in a terraced sense, you may have ballast and logs and salt marsh being installed way ahead of the eroding shoreline as a way to try to interrupt some of that energy and beat it before it meets the shoreline. But something as grand as a larger project with the artificial reefs usually isn't done on an individual property basis. And again, contiguous larger community projects do make a lot of sense.
So,
Although if you do get a biologist involved,
Yeah.
that's, you, with any habitat creation thing,
You're also
you need to
converting.
get DMR on the table and them on board with that plan, because if they can support it, that makes it easy for DEP to permit it, or easier.
and keep in mind that once you impact over 500 square feet in the intertidal or subtidal, you're going to be paying in lieu mitigation fees of approximately $9 or $10 per square foot for your square feet of impact on that bottom.
With that in mind, a lot of us on Newbury Neck have pre-existing old jetties that the fishermen built, to bring their boats in. And they're incomplete, they've been blown around, they're not solid. Where would changing that slightly, adding to it or something, where would that fit into the permitting process and or what we would need to do if we even thought that might be something that would be feasible? Because we've seen it break the energy of waves coming in.
Well, so you could look at potentially whether maybe taking some of the material out, utilizing it in a different place, up higher toward the shoreline, and try to come to a plan that is somewhat of a restoration of the natural area, so that you are removing some of that, what is long ago became impact, long before there were ever permits required, and utilizing that material higher in the landscape where maybe it's providing more function. So again, we're looking at functions and values, we're getting into how best to preserve or improve the habitat that we have while also accomplishing a secondary goal.
Thank you.
George?
I want to piggyback on Rob's question. As difficult as the permitting might be, and it seems to me that the solution paradigm is not right. You shouldn't have to approach this on an individual property by property basis. If each of us acts independently, and I act before my neighbor does, and armor my shore, I'm going to create more problem for him. Because the deflected energy has to go somewhere. And the amount of money each of us is going to spend, if it was somehow pooled, and if there was a collective solution, if the state agencies could look at the permitting and encourage some beta testing or demonstration projects where groups of community, within a community, could work together for a collective solution, it seems to me that the paradigm of solving these problems ought to be changed. And in reality, what we're really doing is reacting to remediate a problem after it's occurred rather than preventing the cause. I know you don't want to mess with Mother Nature, and the Army Corps of Engineers is impossible to work with. But there ought to be some way to catalyze a solution that's not individual property oriented.
Yeah. I guess maybe I'll just jump in and certainly agree with that sentiment that individual property owners are, trying to piecemeal all this is kind of a losing battle, because it does. Every single thing is a domino, it affects something else. Now, what I say, it is allowed, you can team together. So in terms of permitting, we do permit groups together. The hardest part with anything is, with any permitting project, is showing that you have the right to do something on the property. So there's a whole, you gotta show your deed, and you gotta show your limits, and, they are looking at how it would affect the neighboring property owners, and there are sort of some policies in place about if your neighbor doesn't have armoring versus you are, there's gonna be consideration of how that's gonna impact your neighbors. But that doesn't mean that that was always the case in the past. You know, there's tons of riprap out there on the landscape that has and continues to have impacts on adjacent properties. So I definitely agree with you that a more, you know, across the board approach is warranted. I don't know what the mechanism to do that is per se, but one thing you did mention that I wanted to actually talk about, because I talk a lot, I didn't get to it. There's actually some changes that are afoot right now for permitting that I think are going to change some of the things that we've talked about in terms of ease of permitting on the state side of things. So I typed up a couple things that were gonna be, so they're proposing new permit by rule standards that are going to allow for riprap inclusion, so it's not just vegetation in some of these areas where certain conditions are met. So one of them being, it is about risk, so you can do, they're proposing that under this new standard, you could do 100 feet of shoreline stabilization up to base flood elevation if there's a house, commercial structure, or road within 25 feet of an eroding bank or within 75 feet of an eroding bank that's eroding at least 2 feet a year. Or when a water-dependent structure or septic system is at risk. So that's one of the things that they're looking for changes that will kind of streamline some projects that are currently in a individual permit, which can take 3-4 months to get through that whole process. With the permit by rule, which is the 14-day permit. As long as you meet the standards, that's the permit. It's really, you're agreeing to meet the standards, and as long as you do that, that's essentially what the permit is about. And then the other part is that as long as that riprap gets integrated with some of the habitat elements that I mentioned, then that would be able to go through that easier permit process, which would allow more, I guess, still reaction to a degree, but it would allow potentially a quicker reaction.
Do you have an estimated timeline for that?
They're looking
change?
at this fall, so they're drafted, they're putting it before the board, I believe next week, which is the first approval that's needed to kind of start the rulemaking process. But that will be a public process, and I expect it would be this fall and early winter that that'll be taking place.
Rob, I think you were next.
Not to be negative, but you said if the building's 25 feet from the shore, they may be able to do that?
Under permit by rule.
Right, so what I don't understand is, the guy that's 35 feet from the shore, are you basically saying, once you lose 10 more feet and all that still goes into the bay, got all that erosion, then you can protect your property? That's really what you just said.
Right, well, there's always limits, and there's with anything, with a structure, 26
It could
feet
be
versus
45
25
feet,
feet is.
and you can use 20 feet.
I guess I didn't write the rules, so I can't really speak to it.
That's the frustration that people have.
Yeah, well, I guess,
When people make rules without thinking through it.
well, that would be my point to say that the rules have not been made, they've just been, there's a draft that's going to go for public comment, so that would be a great place to be able to voice that point exactly to the folks writing it. Because maybe it isn't 25 feet, maybe it's something else, it's
Right,
just that's a starting point.
Make it as though you were writing, I'm just saying that.
Yeah, I would encourage
That's the first
you,
thing that went through my head is when you said that.
because right now, any project that uses rock is an individual permit, takes 4 months. So what this is doing is trying to separate out some of those riskier ones, I think, is what I view that as.
Sir?
The application process is what I'm interested in.
Okay?
I'm from Deer Isle. Our road association several years back applied for riprap. We filled out an application, right? It takes time. We did it 2 years in a row. Is there any grandfather clause in reference to how long we can use those experiences to continue, or do we have to apply again?
So is the project done? You just you got the permit and didn't do the project?
We did do the project.
Okay.
And unfortunately, with this erosion problem with our road, it's continuing and we need more riprap.
Okay, so you need more riprap in a new location
Uh,
or the same location that's already had
I would
riprap?
say it's in the same location.
Okay, so the same location, it's an existing legal structure, you can maintain it, you can do it without a permit up to 50% of the structure. Anything over 50% is a permit by rule, which is just you have to document the size essentially of, it's a footprint thing, you can't exceed the existing or original footprint and dimensions of the structure, but you're allowed to, without a permit, up to half of it, over half, it's a 14-day permit.
Okay, and just another question in relationship to the project. The erosion is taking place along a roadway that leads off a major highway that's less than 3 feet away from shore. And one of the things the contractor is suggesting that we consider is removing the top layer of roadway and putting a gravel emitting water material below it, and then putting a regular,
Tell drain it.
yes. Yes or no?
That probably would be covered by the maintenance or repair of the roadway, as long as it doesn't leave the footprint of that roadway.
Just, I'm interested in the permit process too, and I think a lot of people might be. A couple things that I've learned through the process that I just want to clarify with you, that other people may want to know. 25 feet. If your house is within 25 feet of the embankment, you need something. The permit may take 4 months, but you can get an emergency approval.
There were some changes made over the winter with some emergency, and I don't have a slide on it, I apologize there, but there's exemptions in the Natural Resources Protection Act that do allow for emergency repair and also emergency placement of some material provided it gets permitted or removed.
Right, and then once it gets permitted, it still goes through the 4 months, but you can
Right.
do the work prior
Right.
to.
Yep.
Okay.
And it's
Just-
good to make sure you talk to code officer and DEP
Yeah.
before, just to make sure you're following the standards. You don't want to end up having to
I
go
will be
back and
using a
change.
certified contractor, and they should, if I'm not mistaken, on the State of Maine website, you can find contractors that are certified by the State of Maine.
Yes.
So that's other information. The other thing, when I was doing this, I didn't really understand the whole process. I would never want to do it again. But I thought I had to use an engineer. And Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, you're telling people that you're probably not going to be able to get to them until next year. I had to do the whole NRPA application. You're also, you said it's probably around $9,000. An engineer like you are not required to do the application. I wanted to just clarify that because I did my application and other people thought that I had to get you involved. So other people may not know
It's
that.
certainly recommended in a lot of
It's-
cases.
I mean,
but-
you know, there's a lot of information that you may not know where to access or how to access or determining where that highest annual tide elevation is and things like that. So, I mean, there's technical information there that you do need to know and incorporate into that plan.
Mm-hmm.
So,
11 different attachments and that application does take you to different places on websites where you can get information. I'm not trying to
No,
do anything,
no,
but
no,
if people
I-
need it done before
it's
you can
true.
help them.
it's true, it's just that, you know, you need to be able to look at the entire picture and be able to incorporate all that information into your plan so that then your plan doesn't get bogged down in review time and things like that.
Right, I got feedback from them already, because I'm within 25 feet. I was looking at, the contractor basically said go across more or less the whole property, which they are not allowing. I know that already because they want you to slope it up and they want you to slope it with the land. They don't want like a 8-foot wall across the whole property. So they will push back on that, just if you know that.
Sir, did you have a question?
I just wanted to know where you could find that certified contractor. I was
So,
wondering about
I'll actually,
As-bid. You call it
because-
as-bid?
is there anyone here that is a contractor by any chance?
What's
Is there
that?
anyone that is a contractor that came tonight? Okay, so, one easy way, so everyone's probably seen Die Hard the movie, so my name is John McClain, and it's really easy to find me online through the DEP website, but if you can't find it by just typing in DEP certified contractor or Maine certified contractor, get in touch with me and I'll send you a link to it. But it's a list of everyone who's taken the class and demonstrated some competency in use of erosion control next to the shore. It doesn't, I will caveat it, that doesn't mean that everyone's an expert in shoreline stabilization. Some of these folks are code officers, some are people that do solar sites and do a lot of like erosion control on big sites. Some of them do specialize, or maybe some of them are landscapers and things. They may have some of the knowledge and they know how to work near the water. It doesn't mean that they're an expert at everything, there is to know about near the water. Just to make sure that understanding. But
Bottom line, there's not enough of you.
that's true all the time.
Can I ask you guys just, we've thrown around a whole bunch of this takes this long and this takes that long. So if I started tomorrow and I have 200 feet of shorefront, and it's been fairly badly eroded, parts of it have been badly eroded in the last two, second January and in the March storm. What if realistically, in order to get to the solution being in place? And I know that there's no one size fits all.
Well, the answer to every regulatory question is
It depends, yeah, but I'm trying to, because I think probably, we all kind of want to know.
You might, if somebody can start tomorrow on the permit process, then in 6 to 8 months, you might be looking at being able to do the work. But a lot of times, you're looking at close to a year between when you say, hey, listen, I want you to look at this, or I want you to do this project, and you are actually doing the project. And that just goes for a lot of these projects, whether it's a commercial project or whether it's a shoreline stabilization project.
Okay, and so my other question with that is, so now we go through this coming winter, and my shoreline now looks different again after I've put in my permit and whatnot.
documented.
Documented.
Yeah.
Well, I
I mean,
have
that
applications
initial
in.
permit application would be still, or, I mean, do I come?
You'd want to update them if there's some like catastrophic failure that's going to affect your design.
Well,
But I think if you're still-
different places have lost another 3 or 4 feet.
Oh, yeah, we're basing our application on, I mean, and it's not a perfect world, but we're basing our application on a moment in time, if you will, on when that survey was done, what those conditions were. We're documenting it with our elevations, with our plan, with the photographs. And maybe there needs to be tweaks once that permit is issued or before that permit is issued, but we're applying for a permit based on the conditions at that moment in time. I have a situation on a site, the cottage was 12 feet away from the shore. The lady sends me the ring video during the storm and the water is washing up underneath the camp. And the vegetation was, when we surveyed it, 12 to 15 feet out from the front of the camp or the cottage. We documented it. It was a moment in time. It was, the hat was here when we did that field survey. Here are the pictures. Here's all the documented evidence. That's our permit application.
So you throw that out? If
Yeah,
No, you
No,
build it to that.
you build it to that.
Yeah.
You build it to that.
okay.
Because these are dynamics. I mean, there's changes happening everywhere all the time.
And I do get that question often.
Now, we do, after a period, we do say, all right, that old plan isn't going to work. Usually it's 2 or 3 years. Like if you haven't done anything, you did a plan 2 years, 3 years ago, and now you never built it, and it's run out, and now you got to put in for a new permit, it's going to be what's today, because you have to put in a new application again. And that's just because the permit expired. There is an expiration to them. One thing I'll add about that whole process is there are things that can be done now-ish to help. They're not gonna fix everything, but, you know, land use stuff, just looking at your land when it rains, see where the water goes, and if it does go towards the bank, you know, taking a look at when it's at low tide and things, look for seeps in like areas where, oh, that's above the water level, or that's above the tide level, why is it wet up here? Or why is that area, you know, have it, like, look like it's oozing or something? And maybe you can do something really easy, permit by rule, through, you know, either just planting without a permit, if it's, you know, seeding or anything that doesn't cause disturbance, or if you're just covering pathways and putting in what we call infiltration steps or water bar steps, that if the water is going down your access way, you kind of like kick it off every once in a while so it's not all going in one direction. There's a lot of like contributing things. You're not going to get at the wave action piece without the permit, but there are other things where you can make the wave action a little bit less of the total, or, you know, eliminate some of the other things that are contributing to making that wave action. Because one of the things that you said very clearly was when soil is saturated, the shear of that soil goes down, so those things don't stick to each other as well, and they just wash away easier. So if you can try and eliminate some of those other sources, you might be able to make your bank more structurally sound at the soil level.
So back to June 12 and dragging the logs up and putting them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Preventative, yeah.
Christmas trees.
That's been successful.
But that's with sand.
Yeah, it's a different system.
Yeah.
But the same thing in a more energetic system, you probably didn't get to it, but they use root wads. And they take like 20 feet, 30 feet of tree still attached to it, and they shove it so it's sticking out. Eventually it is going to break down, but it's got all the, you know, roughness and stuff, so it's sort of breaking it up a little bit. You add that with rock and it's sort of, they help each other in a way.
So
it's similar.
if a tree comes down in a storm or mostly comes down towards the water, we should leave it there?
I mean, if it's not, so there's another, depending on how it falls, it could deflect wave action into somewhere you don't want it to. So some cases, we would say, yeah, leave it. Some cases, that might be like, oh, that's contributing more than it's solving. Generally, you're allowed, like in terms of what you can do versus what, you know, like leaving the tree can be a beneficial thing. Depending on how you use that part of the property, that's going to be a deciding factor of whether that's an adequate idea or solution for you. If you use that for swimming, you're not going to want a tree right in your way. But I talked to someone last week, I went to a site, and they have a tree that's almost about to fall, and they talked to their code officer about removing it as a hazard tree, but they were like, can we just leave it here? And it was going to land in a spot that's going to be really great. And it's like, so they were like,
Then it
we're just going
becomes
to
a
leave it.
battering ram for somebody
Yeah,
else.
well, some of those do need to be anchored. We mentioned that, they were like, if it gets up where the tide can access it, using cable anchors and stuff like that, duckbill anchors to really secure it in there is a recommendation, because you don't want that stuff floating around and taking out somebody's dock or your own dock.
Any other questions, sir?
Rudy Carr, just one question for the gentleman from Geological Survey. The map you showed, I was very fascinated with that. Was that based on actual surveys for the neck? Or, because you have a lot of critical aspects, and some are green, some are red.
Yeah, the bluff erosion map, so most of those were done by site in 150-foot sections about 20 years ago. Although when you click on the data, you can update, you can figure out when a certain area has been updated. I'm not saying that particular map is necessarily 20 years old. But it was done by site to evaluate bluff stability by the Geological Survey. And we try to update them as soon as we hear more information or we get a chance to pass that area again. It is interesting to see some of the trends in that map, such as the most highly unstable bluffs are actually up in the inlet and not more seaward. And that can often be attributed to something like land use. But I don't have the crystal ball or the map in front of me to really make each one of those determinations. Another thing about this is that the shoreline changes every day, and so we have seen cases where stable bluffs become unstable, and we've seen cases where unstable bluffs become stable. So it is not only important to check the map and use the map, but also evaluate the environment and contact us as well. A lot of these environments as is and not necessarily this map, but it is a survey map. You go on, we have the whole coast of Maine. If you click on the map, you can, I think there was a question posed in this paper here, you can enter an address and a location on almost any one of our tools, and the map will take you as a full GIS system on the website to that location and give you all sorts of information. As much as you'd like to dig, you can get statistics and more. Yeah, you can get statistics on beach erosion. You can look at the bluff when it was updated, if it's a particular landslide hazard, if it's a certain elevation, adjacent habitat and land types as well. So yeah, in a long-winded way, maybe I've answered your question, maybe I've not.
Now, is it high enough resolution, and you said you can go back because you do various area photography?
Yep.
We have a problem where, again, we've lost at least 4 feet of banking in this past winter.
Mm-hmm.
And the question that came up before was restoration versus, putting it back to where it was for stabilization. Is it high enough resolution to be able to zoom down so that when we're doing the planning for it, saying like, okay, this is what it was like 6 years ago, and now there's 10 feet of line left. We need to do something because we basically lost a shed in the last one, but the house is really, really close now, and it's obviously creeping.
Sure.
So
with those bluff maps, most of those were not done remote sense or high resolution. They were done with someone on the ground by site assessing each one. The temporal resolution, again, can vary depending on where and how recently someone has updated it. One of the things we've struggled with in the state of Maine and our bluff erosion is that even though these events are dramatic and we can lose a few feet at a time, that all still occurs, say, within 1 pixel of the satellite. So we can't necessarily update this from space yet. But there are a lot of projects, there are a lot of people out there with hobby flyers and drones, and we've also been starting to look into working with communities to help us update maps much more regularly, because almost anyone out there is willing to go take photos and keep us more up to date and help us assess those things. And so we're working on some pilot projects to community source some more of that remote sensing. That bluff map specifically will not have that resolution necessarily that you might be asking for. There are other groups and projects. USDA flies every 3 years for aerial photography. There's a number of ways to source information. MGS also has a really useful digitized historical air photo viewer that may also not have the frequency that you're interested in, but in some cases you can look back as far as the 40s and see flights that were done. Again, that's enter an address and see a historical collection of photos. Of course, resolution is tricky when you're looking at a grayscale from an airplane, but there are a lot of different tools, and we're working and moving towards being able to provide that even sooner and more up to date. It's one of my things I'm trying to champion again is we have the spatial resolution, but not necessarily the temporal resolution. And so how you can help us as well, and I guess especially help speed up some of these processes of providing some of that change over time helps us diagnose the problems.
I will say, the LiDAR data that is updated, again, almost like about every 3 years now, is useful in a lot of things, but when you're out there on the ground with the GPS, it loses its perspective at that break in the slope. So 20 feet from the toe, it's great. 20 feet up gradient, it's great. That 30 or 40 feet right there at the toe and on that slope, it is not very accurate. It may look like a nice 3-to-1 slope on LiDAR, and it's straight up and down for 10 feet. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Was there a question over here?
Yep. I just want to call a number, have a DEP person come out to our site, give us a plan so we can go to a contractor and get it taken care of. That surely exists, this process exists.
There are DEP staff, we can't develop a plan for you.
Why not?
Because there's liability of doing that. That's why he has that's why he stamps
I don't
stuff.
want to wait a year for a PE and spend $9,000. Why can't you guys give us a simple site plan to take to a contract?
It's not, I guess, one of the things is it's not simple. I guess that was part of what we were, there's a lot of factors that need to be looked at in determining, and especially if you're gonna spend somebody else's money, a plan that one person comes up with that's not a professional engineer.
So what happens, if I call you out and do a site visit, what are you going to do?
They'll make suggestions on these are things you could do here. They'll give you this is the permit form, fill this out, send it in. They'll give you that, sort of field level information that you can, have them look at, but they're not, professional engineers with, decades of experience.
So how do
So
you call
it
the
is.
DEP person?
Yep, so here's the numbers right here. So you would be in
Bangor,
the eastern Maine region.
941-4570.
So yeah, that's the 941-4570 is the 207 number. This is the sort of 800 toll-free number. It goes to the same
What did you
same
get,
place.
914?
941-4570.
I've only called it a few 100,000 times.
Few 100,000.
Yeah, and then, this eastern Maine region, there's the 800 number that you can call. And then if people want, because you'll have my, didn't actually put my contact up, but you can also get in touch with me and I can get you in touch with, I don't know who the actual field person is for the town, but I can find out who that is and have them get in touch with you directly.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, sorry, I'm Rich from Bucksport, and Andrew, you helped me with the project during COVID in 2020. The
It
tank.
didn't float away.
It didn't, but
It was close.
it was. The tides obviously are getting higher where we are as well. And luckily with those 3 storms, we weren't at an astrological tide. I think we missed it by a week each time. But my question is, so of course I'm representing a community and we have the walkway. And I noticed sheet piling wasn't an option. But when we attended meetings this winter with the MR, the message was loud and clear, build back, and this is for residents, businesses, municipalities, build back stronger, build back taller. So I guess my question is, where does sheet piling?
It's an option. He utilized it over in the harbor in Brooksville at Bucks Harbor. So you can, it's a really good example of it over there in Bucks Harbor. Let's call it the public access there, right there in the harbor. They just dumped granite there in 1990 something. And so we were looking for something that was going to be a permanent solution, avoiding a lot of additional impact, and that is the solution that we landed on. We came up with a design that, and CPM was the low bidder on that. I mean, there's obviously plenty of contractors that install sheet piling. We designed a sheet pile wall. We put in what we call jet drains in it to allow for groundwater to seep out, or water that built up from the tides to seep out, 2 layers of them. And then, let's see, what else did we do? So then we backfilled it all with a smaller stone that would fill in the voids that were in the large rock, as well as behind the sheet pile, and it made for a beautiful solution. It's not a solution that you're going to undertake typically on a residential site, which is what we're mostly talking about here. But for that type of application, it's certainly a consideration.
And there's different ways of doing sheet piles too. Like there's a lot of ways you see it. It's right on the water edge. It's basically a seawall in that scenario. Other times it can be installed more landward, so it's more of a like protection against and support for, maybe sliding land. So it goes deep and sort of cuts off that process, but then eventually sort of expecting it's probably gonna erode to that. And then the other thing I'll just mention about sheet piles is because I have had a personal experience with it that was very dangerous, you have to watch out with sheet piles with soil types, because I worked on a project where they vibrate, because you vibrate those in.
Yes.
And if you have there was one, it was a sand on top of a clay, and when it hit the clay layer, it turned into liquid, and so there's nothing underneath. And even in the entire thing, like, it was just went, that's like the sound. It was Auburn.
So a geotechnical investigation is necessary to know what's under there to the depth that you're going to need to drive to provide the stability. So that's part of the overall game, is to come in there and do borings and look at those soil profiles and know that then if you utilize, and I can't remember the numbers that we used for the sheet piling, but if you're using a sheet pile that's like 3/8 of an inch or a ½ inch thick, and it's driven 13 feet into that soil, or that substrate, that it's gonna be stable, and or then you need to put tiebacks up high near the ground surface to provide additional lateral stability for it.
And drainage.
And drainage, yes. But yes, it's all a site selection decision, frankly.
And when disturbing the riverbed, the timeline is November through April, is that correct?
For coastal areas, November through April. For inland, it's July through October.
But that's tight, yeah, down
But
there at the
tidal,
waterfront, that's
yeah,
tidal.
tidal, it's all winter,
River, but it's
mostly.
tidal, yeah.
Thanks, Sturgeon.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there no other questions? Nick and Andrew and John, thank you so much.